Hi, and welcome to the Oregon Society of American Foresters 2020 annual meeting. We're coming today with the Forest Pathogens in Oregon session with Sarah Navarro with the U.S. Forest Service. And we're excited to bring you this bonus content today. And Sarah is the Regional Sun Oak Death Pathologist with the U.S. Forest Service. And before working for the Forest Service, she served as a statewide forest pathologist for the Oregon Department of Forestry. With ODF, she provided technical assistance to private and state-owned lands on disease management issues, including both root and butt rot issues. Sarah has a Master of Science in Botany and Plant Pathology from Oregon State University and a Bachelor's in Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, Fungal Biology, and Ecology from the University of California at Davis. Sarah has extensive field experience in working in the woods with both state and federal land managers. So I'm excited to hear what Sarah's going to join me and talk about today. And thanks again, Sarah, for your time.
Yes, thank you for having me. And I'm happy to have this opportunity to present on forest pathogens of interest in Oregon at the annual SAF meeting. This will be great bonus content for everyone. And today I'm going to be discussing root diseases and management techniques with an emphasis on black stain root disease in Northwest Oregon, as we've seen an uptick of it recently. I'm also going to go into foliar diseases of note, including Swiss needlecast, and then lastly discuss new updates on sudden oak death here in Oregon, which, although it only occurs in a small area of the state, we have a new economic impact assessment that explains the future impacts it could have to our state's timber industry. So root diseases, we call them the hidden menace. And we call them this because they are spreading underground. Their primary spread is from dead material. All conifers are susceptible to this type of infection when they are young, typically up to about 20 years old. And this is because after a fire or harvest, the fungus, the root disease fungus, can live in dead roots and then spread to the new generation of trees once they've been planted. Hence why we also call root diseases here in Oregon and across the Pacific Northwest as diseases of the site. So they're always going to be on the site. You're going to have to think about them when you're managing your stand for timber management. The secondary spread where we see large-scale spread on the landscape from root diseases is tree-to-tree spread. So as you can see in this slide, you have those older stumps in the middle of your stand, in the middle of the slide. Those have been there a really long time. We think of them as the inoculum source, so the primary source of spread, and then they're spreading from root-to-root contact underground through live and dead trees. And so this with tree root systems that are large enough, the fungus can move tree to tree across roots. It survives from one generation of trees to the next. And the root disease itself within a stand expands by killing trees and moving across those root-to-root contacts to the next victim. So your stand could start out with a small pocket of root disease, which then extends throughout potentially the whole extent of your stand. And so how can you identify that you may potentially have a root disease in your stand? These are the types of trees that we'll see infected by root disease. So we see trees in various stages of decline. Like you can see in this photo on the slide, you have a tree to the right that is recently dead, and then you have a tree to the left that is starting to see a little bit of discoloration. And we also will see dead and dying trees in groups or scattered. When they're in groups, we think of this as the central root disease pocket within a stand. You can also see tipped out or wind-thrown trees. So root diseases are affecting the structural roots of the trees, and so they're going in and rotting out the wood and those structural roots, which makes them prone to being wind-thrown or tipped out during wind events. All ages of trees are affected in stands affected with root disease because they are acting as pathogens. So they can affect both young trees within a stand as well as older trees. And another characteristic that really clues us in is susceptible species are affected while tolerant species are less affected. And so we see that with root disease such as laminated root disease within a stand, you will see that Douglas fir are highly susceptible to laminated root disease. So you will see them tipping out within a stand, but then we'll see Western hemlock or Western red cedar within a stand completely healthy and unaffected. And so this will clue in forest pathologists and other forest managers into specifically what type of root disease they could have within their stands. You'll see lots of brush because with these tipped out and wind-thrown trees or trees that have died, the brush will take over and will start to grow because of the access to sunlight and access to water within a stand. So stands with root disease can be very brushy compared to stands without. And then lastly, root disease trees are often attacked by bark beetles. On the west side, we see Douglas fir bark beetle go hand in hand in a lot of our laminated root disease and armillaria root disease infected stands. And so root diseases are the most important diseases in Oregon forests because they can have long-term effects in our forest stands, especially in managed stands here in Western Oregon. And so ones to note are laminated root disease, anosum root disease, also known as heterobrasidian root disease, armillaria root disease, black stain root disease, which we'll discuss a little bit more, and then lastly, Porterford cedar root disease, which is it is specific to Porterford cedar. It's caused by an invasive pathogen, a Phytophthora, which we'll go into another Phytophthora suddenoctet later on in the presentation. But Porterford cedar root disease, although it doesn't break down the roots of Porterford cedar, it does kill the tree right at the root collar. And so it's something that is managed for here in Oregon. Unlike with laminated root rot and armillaria root disease, those root diseases are actually affecting the structural nature of those roots. And so one way to manage root diseases within a stand is to know exactly where the root disease is within a stand. And so on our Oregon state forest lands, we conduct root disease surveys. These are typically very inexpensive, about $15 per acre. They're not difficult to do. You are running transect lines through a stand. So you're doing a survey along a specific line and doing it within a specific distance of that next line to get a sense of, is there root disease in the stand? And if so, how big those pockets are. And so if you know where the pockets are, it's very helpful in terms of the planning phase when you're going to replant the stand. And so the best time to conduct these surveys is when the stand is just over 30 years old. And so these surveys can inform decisions about harvesting because some of the root disease management guidelines are to avoid root disease pockets, regeneration of the stand. So what tree species are you going to put back into the stand to make sure that you're not just going to exacerbate the issue of root diseases. And then also the potential for managing for wildlife habitat. I mean, although these root diseases do cause tree mortality, they also invite the opportunity for downed wood, for snags, for gaps that could improve wildlife habitat within a stand. And long-term monitoring of the management outcomes is important as well. So planting resistant species or avoiding those pockets or potentially thinning, you're going to want to, in the long term, look at the monitoring within that stand and look at that. And so in addition to the surveys can also provide locations for post-harvest planting of resistant tree species. So although let's say you don't want a whole stand of Western red cedar or a whole stand of, or the majority of the stand in those resistant species like Western hemlock and Western red cedar, you can use the results from those root disease surveys to plant pockets of resistant tree species like cedar, alder, Western white pine is also resistant to laminated root disease as well as hemlock. So being very judicious of where you plant those resistant tree species while still maintaining Douglas fir if that's what your management objectives are. And so these root disease surveys in the end may prevent poor management decisions because if you were to replant the entire stand back with Douglas fir, you could exacerbate the issue of root disease within the stand, which will then lead to future losses. So looking specifically at black stain root disease, because we have seen an uptick of this disease in both Northwest Oregon as well as outside of Roseburg, we've found that it's important to revisit this issue because it was an issue in our Oregon forest back in the 80s, and then we saw a decline, and we've seen an uptick in it recently. And so black stain root disease is not like laminated and armillaria root disease where they're killing the structural roots and degrading them. Black stain root disease is actually a vascular wilt disease, much like Dutch elm disease. And so what's happening is the fungus is getting in and being spread by root-feeding insects or root-to-root contact. And the fungus then goes into the vascular tissue of the tree and plugs up that vascular tissue, essentially starving the tree of water uptake. And so you can see the fungus actually in the vascular tissue in these photos on the left. So that black staining in the wood is the actual fungus growing in there. And so it's most damaging in 10 to 25-year-old Douglas fir plantations in Western Oregon. It can also affect ponderosa pine in Eastern Oregon. But in the recent uptick of this disease and occurrences, we've seen it affecting stands much younger. We've seen occurrences in stands in between 2 and 6 years old as well. This disease is most severe on disturbed sites and following pre-commercial thinning. And recently, as I mentioned, it's been observed in very young plantations, and it's most severe in disturbed sites and following pre-commercial thinning because of the release of ethanol, which attracts the beetles into these disturbed sites and then spreads the fungus further. And so because of that, we really want people to take home to manage the insect vectors, so manage the release of that ethanol by those disturbed trees. So really evaluating your disease risk. Is there disease in the area? Because beetles can spread this disease up to a few miles from a known infestation point to a new stand. You want to complete your pre-commercial thinning in June or July when the insects are not active. And one large pre-commercial thinning operation is better than several small ones. And that's because you're doing one entry and less disturbance over a longer period of time as well. And with that, you do want to minimize soil disturbance and injury to residual trees during these operations. And then additionally, just like with laminated root disease, favoring species other than Douglas fir in stress situations. So along roadsides, landings, skid rows as well, because those are all areas where you're going to have heavy soil compaction. So if you can favor resistant tree species such as Western red cedar in these areas, it will really help your stands as well. And so some new research that's been coming out on black stain root disease. This is out of Dr. Jared LeBold. This is Forest Pathology Lab at Oregon State University. He had a recent postdoctoral scholar, Patrick Bennett, working on insights to the epidemiology or disease spread and dispersal capabilities of Leptographum wagneriae, which is the pathogen that causes black stain root disease within and between young Douglas fir stands. And so the objectives of the study were to apply the principles of population genomics, or a new molecular biology technique, to better the understanding of epidemiology of black stain root disease and provide knowledge that will aid in the development of effective management strategies. And so to meet these objectives, surveys were conducted in Oregon in 2016. They looked at 20 stands that are spread out in the Forest Grove area, Mary's Peak outside of Corvallis, as well as Roseburg area. And they looked at 4 to 7-year-old stands that were randomly selected from Western Oregon plantations. They found that black stain root disease was present, killing trees in 76% of the surveyed stands. And this indicates a change in the impact of this disease, and it suggests that black stain root disease is an emerging threat in young Douglas fir plantations for the fact that it was found in such a large percentage of the stands that were surveyed. And so what they found was that the genetic differentiation between the plantations suggests a common source So they looked at the genetic code of these different isolates of black stain root disease that they found within the stands, and found that dispersal by insects over this distance is unlikely because of the geographic distance between Forest Grove and Roseburg, but it may be a stepping stone. And so it suggests that human-mediated movement or the trees maybe were infected, the movement of soil, movement of equipment could potentially be causing this larger broader scale of black stain root disease on the landscape. And so infected trees consist of several distinct genotypes, but often distantly related. So what this is showing is that black stain root disease within a stand is not solely the result of a single infection and subsequent spread by root to root contact, but that the stands are consisting of multiple independent infections. And so it's not just one time a beetle comes in and the whole stand is affected, it's multiple entries of the pathogen into the stand. And so what it's telling us, and what OSU is going to be doing more research on, is that long distance dispersal of black stain root disease is important for spreading it across the landscape. So moving to important foliar diseases for Oregon, we've come and reported in the past on both web bite and Phytophthora needlecast. In 2014, 2015, these were two diseases that were emerging in our Oregon forests, affecting both Douglas fir and western hemlock. Since 2017, we've really seen a decline in both of these diseases and have not been seeing new reports of them. And so that's one nice thing to report about on forest pathogens in Oregon, is that we did see an uptick in 2014, 2015, but we really haven't seen a larger increase in these two diseases on the landscape at all. Moving on to Swiss needlecast. It's been an issue in our Oregon forest since the early 90s, and we continue to manage for this disease into the present. And so you can see it causing landscape level infections. The yellow trees within this slide are all Douglas fir affected by Swiss needlecast. The dark green trees are spruce, and then the very bright vivid green is alder within the stand. And so Swiss needlecast is caused by the fungus Nothophea crypticus gamanii. Although it's called Swiss needlecast, it's actually, this is a native disease to the Pacific Northwest. It was just described in Switzerland first. You can see the fruiting bodies of this disease, those black dots on the surface of the needle in the middle slide, and that's the underside of the needle. And so what happens is the air pores, or the stomates of the needle, are clogged by the spore production of this fungus. And infection happens in late spring, early summer, when we have warmer, wet temperatures, and it affects the new year's growth. So you can see the difference between an uninfected needles versus infected needles. And so symptoms of Swiss needlecast disease are yellow foliage or chlorosis, needle loss, and we especially see this in spring before bud break. And so although it causes needle loss, it rarely ever causes mortality in the trees. And so because of the needle loss, this equates to growth loss in Douglas fir. And so that's one thing to mention, is Swiss needlecast is specific to Douglas fir in the Pacific Northwest, and Swiss needlecast can be found wherever Douglas fir is growing in the region. It's just dependent on the location is where the disease can be very severe. And so the fungus has two effects on trees. So it's causing premature loss of foliage, the inability to regulate water loss, and therefore goes into stress sooner. And what this manifests as is growth loss, altered wood properties, as you see in that photo on the left. So looking at kind of side-by-side comparison of trees uninfected by Swiss needlecast, like on the left, versus infected, you see the needle retention on the infected tree is it's less than 1 year in that case. And so you can think about how that would equate to growth loss over time. And it affects both younger trees, like I showed in the previous slide, as well as older Douglas fir trees. And so since 1996, the Oregon Department of Forestry, along with the U.S. Forest Service, has been conducting aerial surveys specifically for Swiss nealcast here in Oregon along the coast. The survey extends all the way from the Columbia River in Astoria all the way down to Brookings in Curry County, Oregon. We fly 2-mile flight lines, and up until 2016, this was an annual survey, and we have since switched it to a every other year survey. So it was last flown in 2018. It was supposed to be flown in 2020, but we had to postpone until next year due to COVID. And so you can see that this disease has intensified on the Oregon coast. The range of where it occurs on the coast has been pretty consistent throughout the monitoring of this disease, but we have seen an intensification of Swiss nealcast over time. And so you can see that in this graph on this slide. And so 2018, we did have a decrease in the acres affected by Swiss nealcast on the Oregon coast. And so it will be interesting to see what the trends are in 2021 when we're able to complete the survey. And so managing for Swiss nealcast in our Oregon forests, we are lucky to have a specific research co-op for Swiss nealcast management here in Oregon. It's the Swiss nealcast Cooperative run through Oregon State University. They have great information for all landowners in Oregon about disease management for Swiss nealcast. And so some of the things that they've looked at and researched over the years are changing species, the effects of thinning, the effects of fungicides, the effects of pruning to the management of Swiss nealcast, as well as planting tolerance. And so some management techniques that we've seen from the air, at least on some ground, is just completely regeneration of a stand. So the Douglas fir were just so infected that they stopped growing completely. They were no longer putting on wood. And so this landowner decided to start completely over in the stand. And so one of the stands you'll see to the right has been cut down and left on the ground, and then they're just going to replant. And then the other stand was treated with herbicide, and they're going to underplant there with resistant species. And so management for Swiss nealcast, the Swiss nealcast Cooperative has recently published a brand new silviculture decision guide, and it's available on the website listed on this slide. The management for Swiss nealcast is very site specific, and it involves 3 steps. The first step is really site hazard assessment, so looking at aerial detection survey results, plot data results from the plot network that the Swiss nealcast Cooperative maintains, looking at models of Swiss nealcast severity and needle retention, and also looking at where your stand is in relation to distance from coast, and also elevation and geographic location is really important. Next, looking at the stand impacts of Swiss nealcast, so doing a visual assessment of stand symptoms of your trees, verifying presence of the fungus, as well as looking into quantitative growth impact assessments on your stand. And those 2 things are really then going to drive your silviculture decision. So whether or not you go with complete regeneration of the stand, looking at alternative or mixed species management, or whether or not your stand would respond to thinning in regards to management of Swiss nealcast. And so again, I highly recommend checking out the Swiss nealcast Cooperative website. It has a lot of great information for management of this disease, as well as the brand new silviculture guide. And then last disease I want to mention in my talk today that highly affects us here in Oregon is sudden oak death. And so sudden oak death is a collaborative management effort here in Oregon between all land management agencies, the U.S. Forest Service, ODF, and BLM, as well as Oregon State University. And then North Carolina State University has recently been helping us with new disease models here in the state. And then finally, the landowners of Curry County, who have been instrumental in helping us slow the spread of this disease here in Oregon. And so sudden oak death here in Oregon is caused by the non-native pathogen Phytophthora ramorum. I mentioned early on that another Phytophthora here in Oregon causes Portofort cedar root disease. And so this one is a sister species to that one, actually. And it was introduced here in Oregon in 2001 was when we first detected it. It was most likely introduced through infected nursery stock. And here in Oregon, in our Oregon forest, tan oak is the key host species for this disease. And so it readily dies from infections of sudden oak death, as well as spreads the disease across the landscape. And so spores are produced in the canopies of tan oaks, which can either spread within a stand and intensify, or these spores within the canopy can be blown off during wind and rain events and spread up to 5 miles in one spread event. And so this pathogen can survive in a variety of substrates, plant debris, soil, and water, which we utilize that aspect of the disease to monitor for it on the landscape. And although the origin is unknown, new research points to Southeast Asia and specifically Vietnam as potentially being the origin of this disease. And although there's many pathways for dispersal, natural spread is through aerial spread and long distance, but we have had other introductions of this disease to our Oregon forest by infected nursery stock. So we had another introduction in 2012 that was 12 miles away from any known infestation. And then most recently, we've had a new strain of the disease, the European strain, or EU1, introduced. So although tan oak is the key species in our Oregon forest, we have many other native vegetation here in Oregon that can be affected by this disease. It typically results in leaf or tip blight, as you'll see in the bottom right slide photos. And so rhododendron, Douglas fir, grand fir, Oregon myrtle, redwood, hemlock are all affected by this disease as well. And so our sudden oak death program in Oregon consists of 5 components, and we've been doing this since 2001. First, survey and detection. We do multiple annual aerial surveys for sudden oak death. We bait stream courses to detect the presence of the pathogen to find new infestations, as well as ground surveys. And so once we detect a new infested site, we then go in and delimit the area to make sure that we know the extent of the infestation. We then go in, treat the infected site, and then we do continuing monitoring and research to look at how effective our treatments are on the ground, as well as tracking the spread of the disease. And then lastly, we have a regulatory and outreach and education component of our program to make sure that we head off any new introductions of this disease in our Oregon forest. And so here in Oregon, part of the way that we're able to do these treatments and manage for the disease is the state quarantine that we have that is unique to Oregon. It's managed under the regulatory authority of the Oregon Department of Agriculture, and it requires private and state landowners to treat sudden oak death on their properties. To date, ODS has been paying for this treatment when required under the quarantine regulation on private landowners. The current quarantine boundary was set in 2015 and has not changed since then. And it currently sits at 515 square miles, or about 30% of Curry County. And we've kept this disease in a portion of Curry County since 2001, in comparison to California, which also has sudden oak death, where 15 counties are currently under federal quarantine. And we know from disease risk modeling research that sudden oak death does have the potential to spread throughout the range of tan oak here in Oregon, which goes into Coos, Douglas, and Josephine counties. And so ODF is in charge of treatments on private and state-owned lands here in Oregon, and the federal agencies, the U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, conduct the same sudden oak death treatments on their ownerships, leading to an all-lands approach for slowing the spread of this disease. And so originally, the sudden oak death program here in Oregon started out as an eradication program. We wanted to eradicate the disease from our Oregon forests. But unfortunately, we were not successful in that. And so in 2010, we shifted the program to our current Slow the Spread program, which is why in 2012, we created the generally infested area, which you'll see on the animation on the left is that red box that appears later on. And so that's an area where treatment under the quarantine regulations is no longer required in that area. And so what is disease treatment for sudden oak death? Well, right now we only have one effective tool in our disease management toolbox, and that is to remove the host, tan oak, from these disease infection sites. And so we cut, pile, and burn tan oak as well as other infested host material, which can be rhododendron, huckleberry, and sometimes myrtle. We treat not only the infected trees that we find, but then a buffer of tan oak around that infected tree, because it takes 1.5 to 2 years from the time of infection to when we can visibly see symptoms on the ground. And so by having a buffered area, we can capture what could potentially be infected, but we are not able to sample. And so we know from recent research out of Oregon State University that larger treatment areas that are 300 or 600 feet outside of that infected tree are the most effective. And so those can be up to from 6 to 26 acres. And it's a costly treatment because of the labor involved in cutting and piling and burning tan oak. So the cost that we're looking at now is about $5,000 to $8,000 per acre. And with that said, there's been no cost to private landowners where treatment is required under the quarantine rule, but there's also no compensation for the loss of tan oak from their property. And to date, across all land ownerships, we've treated about 7,300 acres here in Oregon. And we do know that it works, and that eradication treatments can eliminate disease on the site and stop spread from these infestations if detected early, and treatments are completed promptly and at the proper scale. And we also know what happens when we cease treatments or when sudden oak death is not treated for on the landscape. So this is an aerial image from 2012. And you can see the light green stands of trees are tan oak, and scattered within each of these stands is about 1 or 2 red tan oaks, which are infected with sudden oak death. Fast forward to 4 years later, you see more than 50% mortality in these tan oak stands. And then from last year, some of these stands are completely unrecognizable, that there was even tan oak there, and so they become brush fields. And so because of the potential impacts of sudden oak death to Oregon, in 2016, the Oregon Sudden Oak Death Task Force was formed by Senator Merkley, as well as and co-convened by State Representative David Brock Smith. The task force initiated a study of the economic impact of sudden oak death here in Oregon. This was funded by the Oregon Department of Forestry, and they contracted with Portland-based Highland Economics and Mason Bruce Gerard to conduct this assessment. It was completed just last year, and it was an update of assessment that was completed in 2008. And so this assessment looked at 3 things. It looked at the economic impact of sudden oak death since the discovery of sudden oak death in 2001 up to 2018, where we had complete data for, and then it looked at the potential economic impacts from 2019 through 2038, so 20 years into the future for the 4-county region of Curry, Coos, Douglas, and Josephine County. And it looked at the future economic impacts under 3 different scenarios, which were halting all treatments in the future, and then looking at what our current service level will get us, and then looking specifically focused at just treating that European strain. And lastly, the assessment also looked at the non-timber impacts, which can be hard to quantify in an economic value, but it did a good job of summarizing potential impacts in property values, ecosystem services, cultural values, as well as wildfire risk in the area. And so for timber impacts, the assessment found that currently, or up until 2018, there were no detectable job or wage losses due to sudden oak death in the area. There were actually moderate job gains through the employment of sudden oak death foresters for both ODF and Forest Service, as well as providing work for contract treatment crews in the area. And there was an undetectable impact to timber export value via the port of Coos Bay, which is the closest deep water port to our sudden oak death infestations in Oregon. And so looking at the future economic impacts, so the 20 years in the future, so if Oregon was to halt all treatments as of January 1st, 2019, the impacts that might occur as sudden oak death expands into Coos County, because as I mentioned earlier, it has the potential to expand throughout the range of tan oak. And so this could happen as soon as 2028 if treatments were halted as of the first of last year. And so some of the potential economic impacts associated with the disease spreading into Coos County are potential sanctions on Southwest Oregon timber exports by China, Japan, or Korea, which could equate to the loss of 1,200 jobs related to timber export, or which equates to about 58 million in annual wages lost in the area. A reduction in timber harvest by 15%, and then the potential decline in rural residential property value. And so what this means for Oregon is funding sod treatments for a total cost of 30 million over the course of the next 20 years could potentially offset the loss of 1,200 jobs by 2028, and then the potential for the loss of 580 million in wages over the course of the next 10 years if sanctions were to come into play. And so this is a 19-to-1 cost benefit to continue doing treatments in Oregon. And some of the non-timber impacts that were looked at, we're looking at the impacts to cultural practices with great historic and traditional meeting, acorn gathering, materials for basket weaving, and hunting were all identified by tribal representatives interviewed for this economic impact assessment. And some of them were reporting that they're already being compromised by sudden oak death, as tribal members are worried about spreading the disease into areas that are not known to be infested. They also found the potential for reduced rural residential property value and loss of real estate transaction revenues in the future if the disease was to proliferate in these rural residential areas. They found potentially there could be a potential decline in recreation and tourism if the public perception became unfavorable in the region due to the die-off of tan oak trees and the closing of recreation trails. And then a key concern regarding sudden oak death voiced by many during the interviews conducted for this assessment was the potential increased wildfire risk associated with stands of dead trees and dry wood. And so looking into the future of sudden oak death here in Oregon, all lands and all agencies and stakeholders are continuing to slow the spread of sudden oak death in Oregon with a greater focus on ensuring tan oak conservation and looking at research into the resistance to the pathogen with our Oregon tan oak. We've recently started acorn gathering as well as field and lab testing to try to look for resistance. We need to have a deeper dialogue on transitioning to living with the disease in certain areas of Curry County, and then establishing a long-term approach to identifying and funding public safety infrastructure and property damage concerns, especially in regards to those wildfire hazard and public road risks. And so the bottom line, the takeaway that I'd like you to have for forest pathogens here in Oregon are that management options do exist for all the forest pathogens I mentioned today, and that assistance is available through our different agencies as well as Oregon State University, and these are some great links that provide that type of information. And whatever information that you're not able to find on these websites, there's extension foresters and forest health specialists around the state that are more than happy to help you. And so with that, I'd just like to thank again the Oregon Society of American Foresters for providing me this opportunity to present on Oregon's forest pathogens. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That's a great information that you shared. Great overview of those different pathogens that are dealing around in Oregon's forest. How about If a forester wanted to keep up to date on what pathogens might be affecting their area, those were some great resources. Are there newsletters or other things that you would suggest that they track to help maybe know what they're being impacted by there locally?
Definitely the annual Oregon Forest Health Highlights is a great publication. It's put out every year and available through the ODF Forest Health webpage, and that's where forest health specialists around the state are queried on what they're seeing on the ground and what diseases, impacts, and other invasive species that they've been dealing with across the landscape. So that's definitely a great publication to be on the lookout for. And it typically comes out in March of every year.
Okay, great. So those of you that have joined us today and also want the continuing education credits or CFE, your passcode for this is pathology. So again, that's pathology for your continuing education passcode. I have a couple more questions for Sarah. We just experienced these big, large Labor Day fires, really catastrophic. And can you talk about maybe what we should be thinking about as we approach how we're going to restore and recover these lands? What are some things along the path of forest pathogens that need to be into that thought process?
Yeah, that's definitely a really good question and something that I think is going to be on a lot of people's minds moving forward. And I think I mentioned it early on in the presentation, but definitely in terms of root disease management, as it is the most important disease that we have here in Oregon, fire does not kill root diseases within the soil. And so it's something that if you noticed those symptoms in your stands beforehand, think about what trees you're going to use for regeneration purposes within those stands, because the root disease is still going to be there even after fire.
That's a really good point. What about when we're thinking about seedling selection? Obviously, I think we're also going to be in a point where people are going to be looking for seedlings across, maybe even outside of Oregon. So thinking about, with sudden oak death and that, just think about any suggestions for when we're dealing with thinking about bringing in seedling stock that might not even be here locally. Any thoughts to that idea too around where we're going to get all these seedlings and any concerns there of bringing pathogens in that we don't necessarily aren't thinking about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Definitely making sure that you know your seedlings, the seed zone that it is, so the seedling source. We have seed zones here in Oregon, and if you are planting a seedling outside of its known zone, you can have diseases like foliar diseases that really hit it hard because it's grown in a more moist environment than it's typically grown in, or a more dry. So something like rhabdocline is a foliar disease in Douglas fir that we see highly prevalent in off-site seeds or off-site seedling plantings. So it's definitely something to think about is, although you may be able to get those seedlings right away, if they're not meant for your site, then you could be dealing and managing with other issues later on.
Great. That's some really good suggestions. And thinking about the Swiss needle cast, it's been on the radar for a long time now. And I know especially people managing on the coast, this is something that they look at every time they do a harvest or even just as they're inspecting stands. What do you think may have contributed to that little bit of a, maybe good news coming out of 2018 and hopefully as we watch that trend down? Do you think that's just people starting to understand how to manage for it? Do you think it's, resistant seedlings that are growing up on the landscape, or do you have any theories on why we might seeing that?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and it's something that we've been asking, forest health specialists have been asking ourselves as well. And so I think we will, with the plot data that's coming out of the Swiss Needle Cast Co-op and other on-the-ground observations, I think we'll get more reliable information on why that is. But definitely, industry has been very, very proactive with switching to management of hemlock and spruce in a lot of those areas. And so we have seen a decline in pure Douglas fir stands. It could also be a function of when the aerial survey took place and how the symptoms were viewed. And so it's really going to be interesting in the next survey that we do if we continue to see that downward trend.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, Sarah, for your time today. I'll just give you any last words that you might want to share. And then if people have questions that I haven't asked or other things that have come up as they were watching this, is there a good way to connect with you or maybe other pathologists that, you know, I know like Dave Shaw that also you work closely with. So what would be the best way if somebody has a question for them to follow up with someone maybe about these?
Yeah, good question. They're more than happy or more than welcome to email me at sarah.navarro@usda.gov. And if I can't answer the question, I will definitely point them in the direction of someone that can. And then if folks want to rewind the presentation just a little bit to capture that slide that had those links, it also has information for other forest health specialists around the state as well.
Great. Well, thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it. A lot of great information, and definitely, I think as we go through these wildfires and recovery and thinking about how we're going to approach the landscape, thinking about what was happening there before the fire is also really important to remind people. So thanks for bringing that up today. Thanks, Sarah, again for your time, and keep up all this great work and helping to keep the forest healthy and thriving. So appreciate all that you've been doing.
Thank you.